The Good Samaritan. On a warm afternoon in Jerusalem, as the golden light filtered through the leaves of olive trees, a teacher of the law approached Jesus with a question that would lead to one of the most profound and enduring stories ever told. The air was filled with the gentle murmur of people gathered to listen, and a soft breeze carried the sweet scent of blooming flowers through the courtyard. The teacher, a learned man who had spent his life studying sacred texts, stood before Jesus with genuine curiosity in his heart. "What must I do to inherit eternal life?" he asked, his voice carrying across the peaceful gathering. Jesus, with his characteristic wisdom and gentleness, responded by asking what was written in the law, inviting the teacher to share his own understanding. The teacher spoke words that were familiar to all who heard them, yet carried endless depths of meaning. "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength, and with all your mind, and love your neighbor as yourself." His voice was clear and confident, for these were words he had studied and taught many times before. Jesus smiled warmly, acknowledging the truth in the teacher's words. "You have answered correctly," he said softly. "Do this and you will live." But the teacher, seeking to understand more deeply, posed another question that opened the door to one of Jesus' most beloved parables. "And who is my neighbor?" he asked, his words hanging in the air like leaves waiting to fall. Jesus, seeing the genuine desire for understanding in the teacher's eyes, began to weave a story that would touch hearts across generations. His voice took on the gentle rhythm of a master storyteller as he painted a picture of a lonely road that all his listeners knew well. The dangerous path that wound its way from Jerusalem down to Jericho. The road he described descended through rocky terrain, dropping more than 3,000 feet through barren wilderness. It was a path notorious for its danger, where travelers often fell prey to bandits who hid among the rocks and caves. As Jesus began his tale, his listeners could picture clearly the sun-baked stones and deep shadows of this treacherous route. A certain man was making his way down this winding road from Jerusalem to Jericho. Jesus continued, his voice as soothing as evening wind through olive branches. The traveler walked alone, his sandaled feet carefully finding purchase on the dusty path that curved between towering limestone cliffs. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the rocky terrain, and the air was still and heavy with heat. Perhaps this man was a merchant, returning home after selling his wares in the holy city, or a craftsman who had completed his work at the temple. Whatever his purpose, he carried with him not just his possessions, but also his hopes, his dreams, and his responsibilities to those waiting for his return. The weight of his journey rested upon his shoulders as he made his way carefully down the descending path. He might have been thinking of home, of loved ones waiting for his return, when tragedy struck from the shadows. Robbers, who had been watching from their hiding places among the rocks, emerged suddenly on the path. In a moment that changed everything, they fell upon the traveler with cruel intent. They took not only his possessions, but also stripped him of his clothing, leaving him wounded and alone on the sun-baked earth. The injured man lay there, his breath coming in shallow gasps, unable to move or call for help. The sun continued its slow arc across the sky, its heat beating down upon his exposed skin. Small clouds of dust rose and settled with each labored breath, and the silence of the wilderness pressed in around him. His only hope lay in the chance that someone would pass by and show mercy. As fate would have it, a priest was traveling that same road. This man of religious authority would have been easily recognizable by his bearing and garments, one who spent his days in service at the temple, leading others in worship and teaching the laws of Moses. Surely, such a person would stop to help a fellow traveler in desperate need. The priest saw the injured man from a distance, perhaps noting the still form lying in the dust of the road. But instead of approaching, he moved to the other side of the path and continued on his way. His footsteps faded into the distance, leaving only silence and the soft whisper of wind through the rocks. Soon after, a Levite approached along the same path, his footsteps echoing softly against the stone cliffs. Like the priest, he too was a man devoted to religious service, one who assisted in the temple and knew well the laws of compassion and care for others. He drew near enough to see clearly the wounded man's condition, perhaps even hearing the faint sounds of suffering. Yet, like the priest before him, the Levite also chose to cross to the other side of the road. His steps quickened as he passed by, leaving the injured traveler alone once more in his pain and desperation. The sun continued his westward journey, and shadows began to lengthen across the rocky ground, bringing with them the threat of approaching evening. Then came the sound of another traveler, the gentle clip-clop of a donkey's hooves on the stone path. This time, it was a Samaritan who approached, someone who would have been considered an outsider, even an enemy, by those who had passed by before. The Samaritans and Jews of that time regarded each other with deep suspicion, separated by centuries of cultural and religious differences. But when this Samaritan saw the wounded man, something extraordinary happened. His heart was moved with compassion, a feeling that transcended all barriers of culture and prejudice. Without hesitation, he stopped his journey and approached the injured traveler. The soft sounds of his footsteps on the dusty ground marked the beginning of an act of kindness that would echo through centuries. With gentle hands, the Samaritan knelt beside the wounded man. He took out his own supplies, vessels of oil and wine that he carried for his journey. With careful tenderness, he cleaned the man's wounds, the wine helping to cleanse and the oil to soothe. His touch was careful and deliberate, each movement aimed at bringing comfort and healing to the suffering stranger. The Samaritan spoke soft words of reassurance as he worked, though the injured man might have been too weak to fully comprehend them. He tore strips from his own clothing to create bandages, binding the wounds with skilled hands that showed both practice and care. The afternoon light grew softer as he worked, casting a golden glow over this scene of unexpected mercy. With infinite care, the Samaritan helped the wounded man onto his own donkey, supporting him gently to ensure he did not fall. The animal moved with careful steps, seeming to understand the precious nature of its burden. The Samaritan walked alongside, one hand steadying the injured traveler, while the other guided the donkey along the safest path through the rocky terrain. As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the cliffs in warm hues of amber and rose. They made their way to an inn that stood as a welcome refuge along the dangerous road. The inn was a simple building of stone and timber, its windows glowing with welcoming lamplight as evening approached. Here, travelers could find rest and safety from the perils of the wilderness. The innkeeper came out to meet them, his experienced eyes taking in the situation at a glance. Without question or hesitation, he helped the Samaritan ease the wounded man from the donkey's back. Together, they carefully carried him inside, where the air was cooler and the light softer. They brought him to a quiet room, where he could rest and begin to heal. The Samaritan stayed through the night, tending to the injured man with patient dedication. He sat beside the stranger's bed, offering water when needed, adjusting blankets for comfort, and keeping watch as the stars wheeled slowly across the desert sky. His own journey delayed, he chose to remain present with this person whose name he did not even know. When morning came, bringing with it the soft light of dawn and the gentle stirring of a new day, the Samaritan knew he must continue his journey. But his care for the wounded man did not end with his departure. He approached the innkeeper with 2 denarii, silver coins that represented 2 full days' wages. Taking care of this man was no small expense, yet the Samaritan gave freely, without reservation. "Look after him," the Samaritan said softly to the innkeeper, "and when I return, I will reimburse you for any extra expense you may have." His words carried not just a promise of payment, but a deeper commitment to seeing this act of kindness through to its completion. He would not abandon the wounded traveler until his recovery was assured. Jesus' voice grew gentle as he turned back to the teacher of the law, who had first asked the question, "Which of these 3 do you think proved to be a neighbor to the man who fell among robbers?" he asked. The answer hung in the air like morning mist, clear and unmistakable to all who had listened to the tale. The teacher responded with quiet understanding, "The one who showed him mercy." In those simple words lay the recognition of a profound truth that transcended all artificial boundaries and prejudices. The answer came not from scholarly debate or legal interpretation, but from the heart's natural response to compassion freely given. "Go and do likewise," Jesus said softly, his words carrying both invitation and gentle challenge. These 3 simple words contained within them a revolutionary way of seeing the world and relating to others. They called listeners then, as they call us now, to expand our understanding of who our neighbor might be. The story settled over the gathering like a warm blanket, inviting deep reflection. In its gentle narrative lay profound truths about the nature of love and the true meaning of being a neighbor. It showed how mercy knows no boundaries, how compassion transcends all divisions of race, religion, and social status. The Samaritan, considered an outsider by society, became the embodiment of divine love in action. Through this parable, Jesus painted a picture of love that goes beyond mere feeling or obligation. It was love expressed through practical action, through the willingness to be interrupted, through the sacrifice of time and resources. The Samaritan's compassion cost him something: his time, his supplies, his money, his convenience. Yet he gave without hesitation or complaint.